We think everyone is joining, so let's begin. Hello, everybody. I'm Athreya Mathur, the Director of Legal Research at the Center for Art Law, and I'm so excited to welcome you to our Art Law Colloquium on Censorship and Artistic Expression on college campuses, our first ever colloquium and our first event of the fall semester. I would like to welcome everyone here and thank Amy Werbel, our speaker, for returning to the center, and also a welcome to the students from Artist Representation Society of Fordham Law. Before we begin, and as per usual, I'll give you a quick introduction about the center. We are a Brooklyn-based research and education nonprofit, and we're dedicated to offering resources and programming to advance the arts and law community. We have our website, our newsletter, our events, and we try to disseminate information and keep our audience updated on everything art law. You can also consider becoming a premium member to receive tons of offers, discounts for our events, and access to our Case Law Corner, articles, and archives and videos of past events. We have a ton of upcoming programs as well this fall semester, including an ABCs for Art series, starting with A is for authenticity, B is for blockchain. We even have an event on art, poetry, and law coming up, and an event on fan art and fair use. We have our legal clinics on immigration and artists and art dealer relationships this semester as well, where we pair artists and attorneys together for one-on-one consultations. So you can view most of these on our website and register for hopefully all of them so we can see more of you. A few of our usual housekeeping items. This program is being recorded for archival purposes, but like I said, we would love to see you, so you can feel free to keep your camera on. And once the video and the recording is available, we'll send the recording of the session and a survey for the event to you by email. If you have any questions for our speaker, we will have a question and answer session later, so you can put them in the chat box below. Coming to our topic for today on artistic expression and censorship, I really do think that a free society is based on the principle that every individual has the right to decide what art or entertainment they want, what they find pretty, what they find aesthetic, or what they do not want, what they'd like to receive and what they'd like to create. So once you allow the government to censor somebody else, you cede to it the power to censor you, your art, or something that you love. So for this interesting topic, let me finally introduce our wonderful speaker for today, Amy Werbel. Amy is a professor of the history of art at the State University of New York, Fashion Institute of Technology. Her research has concentrated on censorship at the intersections of law and culture, and particularly in relationship to the freedom of artistic and sexual expression. Her most recent book is Lust on Trial, Censorship and the Rise of American Obscenity in the Age of Anthony Comstock. So Amy has lectured nationally and internationally on the damaging impact of censorship, not only on artistic expression, but also on pluralism and democracy more generally. All topics that are extremely contemporary and need conversation and discourse on. So without any further ado, Amy, we're so excited to hear from you. The Zoom screen is now all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Athreya, and welcome to all of the students out there and those interested in censorship and artistic expression. That was a lovely introduction. I just wanted to highlight, I put on the screen that I teach here at FIT in the History of Art department. I'm also going to be referencing two particular kind of professional spheres that I've been in. I served as a Fulbright Scholar, actually I should have added, to China 2011 to 2012, and I'll mention that a little bit, and also to the United Kingdom 2019 to 2020. And then last year I was a fellow at the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. And that's sort of relevant to my journey in this kind of area of intellectual interest. So I'm going to give you kind of an overview of the development of my thinking and my research about art censorship and art censorship and kind of freedom of expression issues. And then hopefully you, as this is a colloquium, so that means we can talk together, and I'm interested to hear what you are particularly interested in. So I want to start with, I like to always start my classes with what I call a brain warm up. I want to throw out some questions for you to think about. And the first one is, before I get started, do you think I should provide a content warning, right? I've already told you, and Threa has told you, that I specialize in sexual expression and censorship. So do people think I should provide a content warning? And if so, what kinds of content should I warn audiences about? And you can already start to imagine that hopefully this is raising other questions for you, right? Well, is everybody, an adult? Are you being forced or required to do this for some reason? That might make a difference. What happens if I make a content warning like that of something that you actually are worried about? Are you going to sign off? What purposes would the content warning serve? Like, what am I afraid of? What are you afraid of? Like, why am I doing that? What am I hoping to avoid? What could happen to me? This is being recorded, right? This is potentially going to be out there in the world. Clips could be made from it. What could happen to me if I present images that cause offense? What could happen to the Fashion Institute of Technology if I cause offense, right? What if people start writing in, I saw your professor talking about this horrible thing? And what could happen to the Center of Art Law if I cause offense? Hopefully you're all getting really nervous right now, right? And that nervousness, right, is what makes people self-censor. All of that potential fear of what could happen to me personally, to my job, my place of employment, these nice people who invited me to give a talk. And then we need to ask, does anybody in these scenarios have legal liability? Like if I were to show something that was actually deemed in some court to be illegal, something deemed to be obscenity, who has legal liability? Right now, it's very much being debated whether social media platforms should have liability for what I show. Who's the editor? Who's the publisher? And then, of course, I'm not even mentioning my speaker agreement said, right, I'm not going to violate copyright. But my speaker agreement didn't say I'm not going to show obscenity. So now Irene probably getting very nervous. But I want to reassure you, I'm not actually going to show anything that's going to get anybody in trouble today, I hope. But that's the thing, is like, do I know what's going to cause offense in the world? Not really. Like, do any of us really know? So my research specialization is art, censorship, and sexuality. All those questions that I've been raising to you cross over historic periods of time. They cross over different media. I started out as a very straightforward art historian working on an artist named Thomas Eakins, who made, and that's my first book on the left, and he made a lot of paintings that had nudity in them. And in the 19th century, he ran afoul of art censors, especially people who wouldn't exhibit his work in galleries, wouldn't reproduce his work. And then he got fired from his job at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And he made this painting in response. He made this is just a detail of a painting called The Agnew Clinic on the left, where you see a breast cancer surgery taking place. And Eakins actually made this painting in response to being fired. And so I want to talk a little bit about the way artists behave when they get censored, which is not always what you expect. So I wrote that book, and then I lived and taught in Guangzhou, China for a year as a Fulbright Scholar. And that was really interesting. And what I said in my application to go to China was I really wanted to experience what it was like to teach in a society that was heavily censored. I mean, the most censored society in the world. And I never thought they would say, yes, go, but they did. And I actually, it was very interesting. My lecture on the history of censorship in the United States was the #1 most requested lecture on the speaker circuit in China. And I think mostly because people were intrigued that there was ever any censorship in the United States. They had this idea of the US as a total kind of free expression bonanza. But then it also enabled them to talk about, sometimes in a sideways way, about the way censorship affected teaching and learning and creation of art and free expression in China as well. So I'm just see the chat. Okay, so if anybody wants to, raise a hand or throw a question in the chat, please do. And then my last book, which was published in 2018, is Lust on Trial, Censorship and the Rise of American Obscenity in the Age of Anthony Comstock. And in that, I was really looking at the career of America's most prolific censor, certainly most prolific art censor, and the way people made money off of it. They would bait him to try to, oh, come see the show Anthony Comstock doesn't want you to see. And then they would, triple their ticket sales. And so I was really interested in the way that censorship could actually produce more of the content that it was trying to suppress. And just one small example of that was the image that you see on the left, which was published by students. They had a student magazine called the American Student of Art, and they published examples of life drawings that were made in the building that's still there on 57th Street. And it was really to show how American students didn't have to go to France or Germany anymore. They could do art classes in New York and get the same kind of access to models. And it was censored. Comstock seized and burned almost all of them. There's just a half dozen left because of the full frontal nudity. In response to that, Thomas Eakins made his first painting with full frontal nudity the next year, and that was just part of a wave of paintings of full frontal nudity that followed the extraordinary press coverage of the seizure of this art magazine. It backfired really terribly for Comstock, and again produced exactly the kind of cultural expression that he didn't want, and made it seem modern and fresh and chic. He made nudity chic in his 43 years of trying to suppress nudity. Okay, so, all right. Then when I went to England for a year, I was doing a study of art censorship before World War I, and I found the same effect. So Sir Frederick Leighton painted this Venus and Cupid at exactly the same time the Obscene Publications Act was being debated in Parliament. And it's his first full frontal nude and one of the largest paintings of his career, and clearly intended to basically say, debate whatever you want. I'm Sir Frederick Leighton and I will paint whatever I choose to paint. And I was also interested in the way that this kind of show of courage and independence, and again, like a chic, modern approach to nudity and sexuality, was also taken up by women artists because they're trying to compete with the men. And so they get kind of put into a very interesting dialogue with the female nude, because to paint the female nude, we can see it as being objectifying, and for female artists to do that, to sort of like play into kind of a patriarchy, and yet for them it was kind of a form of like getting into the game, getting into the big shows, selling work to wealthy patrons. So I was interested in all those dimensions of gender and power. And I've also written about art censorship on social media. And much the same phenomenon of artists' response is true today as it was, 150 years ago. And one thing I would say is, when we think about art censorship, and the potential for prosecution or the potential for having your work destroyed, most people probably self-censor, but we don't know what we don't have, right? It's very hard to actually gauge what it is that people don't create or produce because of the fear of personal, professional, or institutional liability. But we can observe the way artists behave in resistance, because they want that resistance to be visible, right? They're trying to take what is being called obscene. Obscene literally means off stage. That which should not be seen in public should be off stage, and they're trying to put it into the public stage. So in the lower left here, you can see there's a website, Artists Against Social Media Censorship, where they post images that they have made to try to confuse the algorithms. And I love Jacqueline King, a sculptor who's making a bra that's not her breasts, that looks like her breasts. So when social media sites take it down, she can say it's not actually breasts, right? It's a sculpture. And if you look at the rules that have, Facebook and Instagram, all these companies have, they will say, oh, nudity is okay if it's, art, but not if it's, like graphic, photographic, So you can see Savannah Spirit kind of messing with that. Like like you tried to make a line between the photographic nude and the painted nude or I'll just mess with you. Nicole Hebron is a particularly kind of wonderfully obnoxious resistor. She had organized a group of artists to go and meet with Instagram right here in New York, and then went outside and took a picture nude in front of Instagram headquarters and posted it on Instagram. And has also been involved in a pretty broad free the nipple campaign. I don't know if you guys have followed this at all, but male nipples are okay and female nipples are not. And so artists were circulating this sort of clip art of a male nipple that you could put over a female nipple so that you could, like, when it got taken down, you would respond. It's not a female nipple. It's on a female breast, but it's a male nipple. So what are you gonna do about that? And then just last week, this article in Hyperallergic, artists tell Instagram we're done. And artists are moving to platforms like porn platforms, like OnlyFans and Pornhub, which is really pretty interesting because that line between what's considered pornography, which literally means writing about prostitution, but it's sort of like illicit sex, right? But it's not, pornography doesn't mean it's illegal. Obscenity means it's illegal. But I think people are more familiar with the term pornography, and that debate between what's pornography and what's art has really been going on since the advent of photography, when people started photographing nudes that look like paintings, and people saying, well, that's, not okay. But that dividing line, it's sort of interesting when you think about that dividing line being what platforms people are actually able to share their images on. And then what does that do to audiences? What does that do to potential sales? Because Instagram is an enormous marketplace for artists to reach dealers, to reach patrons. And so the stakes are very high for artists as far as what social media companies allow. And this is very much in play with all of the legislation that's being debated, not only in the US, but of course the EU has been imposing new regulations of social media platforms. All of this is very global and hard to contain. And I think right now what's happening is that there's a kind of a ratcheting up of censorship. And I'll tell you, we've been advertising a webinar I'm doing with another UC fellow in mid-October, called Art and Porn on Campus. And when we've been circulating that, it keeps getting taken down. It's getting a warning label, and there's no picture in it. It's just like the UC National Center kind of logo with, sign up for the webinar, Art and Porn on Campus. So I think really right now, the levels of censorship on social media are just extraordinarily high and getting higher. And they're, if Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is kind of messed with, then there is going to be liability on social media platforms, for people to be for the platforms themselves to be prosecuted for circulating obscenity. And so then, we're going to be in a very different place than we have been. Okay, so that's something I've been keeping my eye on. 3 statements that I would like to just very clearly make. I am surprised that there is not more litigation regarding art censorship. People that I speak with seem to be unaware of relevant laws and past court decisions. And the current wave of divisive content laws in educational settings probably will spur more litigation in this area. More than a third of these, some people call them critical race theory or the woke act bans actually extend to higher education. Think about that. That is, and a lot of the ones that I'm talking about, these are laws that have been proposed, but not necessarily passed. And I think it's, we're in early days as far as not only what's going to pass, but also how these laws are going to be enforced and how courts are going to look on potential enforcement of these laws. So I think there's going to be a lot more litigation. Right now, we're just hearing about books being taken out of libraries, but pretty soon you're going to see art being taken down from exhibition. So I just wanted to go through for the law students out there, a few relevant decisions. The Supreme Court's decision in Papish versus Board of Curators of the University of Missouri in 1973 reaffirmed that public universities cannot punish students for indecent or offensive speech that does not disrupt campus order or interfere with the rights of others. And art generally has been considered to be speech. And that's been very broad over the course of the 20th century, right? Film became speech, not, and so just to keep that in mind. In NEA versus Finley, 1998, SCOTUS held that Congress was entitled to set spending priorities. And so this was a case where some artists who did some pretty edgy work were had their sort of grants taken away, and basically the government was able to sort of argue that it had was asserting certain spending priorities and how government funds were spent. And so we see that basically it means that in a weird way, there can be more prior restraint, because if they're giving out grants and they're specifying everything except, sexuality as kind of the things that they're interested in, they're basically telling you what they're not going to fund, if that makes any sense, hopefully. Oh, and did I already emphasize that I am not a lawyer? So I come at this from the perspective of trying to kind of weave together an understanding of the way law frames culture and the way culture then shapes law, and that kind of symbiotic relationship between these two in real life. Third case I want to mention is Hopper and Rapp versus City of Pasco. The Ninth Circuit ruled that government cannot create a public forum and then remove art on the basis of its content viewpoint. And so this is like the flip side of the NEA versus Finley, which is that in this case, the city had not set any guidelines. They just said it's open, put your art in City Hall as long as you're a resident. And then a woman put in actually quite small, to my mind, really banal nudes that were removed. And the Ninth Circuit ruled that the government couldn't, on the basis of content viewpoint, after it had already created a public forum for speech, it couldn't then decide some of that speech was not acceptable. Certain types of speech, including obscenity and incitement to violence, do not have First Amendment protection. And in a variety of cases, SCOTUS has held that time, place, and manner restrictions cannot be unreasonable and must be content neutral. So these are all the things when you think about like a campus art controversy or any other kind of art controversy that involves state agents. These, cases should be in the back of your mind, that the courts have kind of held that people can't do, just take down whatever, that state agents can't just take down whatever they find offensive. Okay, sorry, I was just checking the chat. Okay, now I need to make the chat go away. So for those of you who don't know, I won't read this, but the Miller test is basically the standing language through which obscenity is supposed to be judged. And it's very hard to get a conviction on the basis of how broad this is, that it has to lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value on the basis of contemporary community standards, with a third prong judged on a reasonable person standard. And I would just say that the internet makes that question of what is the community? What community are we talking about? I mean, in the case of social media platforms, you're often including countries that have very restrictive censorship. And so, these are kind of serious questions. All right, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of my chat window here. Oh, there we go. Nope, sorry. Okay. All right, can you still see everything okay? Yes, okay, so it says yes. All right, so finally, I want to get to the research that I did last year at the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. Now, the funny thing is, I titled this, "We All Want to Talk About This," because this is something a curator said to me. And then what I've been finding is that, many people are not talking about this. And so that statement actually has proved to be kind of interesting. So during my research fellowship, I interviewed 25 curators or directors of campus art museums for 45-minute interviews. And on the basis of those interviews, I made a survey that 90 academic art museum and gallery curators and directors completed. And the curators that I initially reached out to, some of them had been involved in campus controversies. Some of them were referred to me. And then some I chose because for a broad range, like I had a couple of HBCU curators and a tribal college campus curator. So I wanted to kind of survey the landscape. And the first thing I think is really important, well, actually, I just want to give an example of one of these campus art controversies. In 2016, Winthrop University, which is public institution, I think it's South Carolina or North Carolina, one of them, threatened to expel Samantha Valdez because it claimed her art project calling attention to buildings named for enslavers, quote, disturbed the public order and peace. Now this went to FIRE, which is the Foundation for, Foundation for Individual something and Expression. But they basically monitor campus free expression and censorship controversies, and like throw everything on social media. And so ultimately, when this became public, that university had to back down. And right now, that's pretty much what always happens in these cases. What the curators would call it is going up to legal. That when these things go up to legal, like they have, and a lot of these things start with a student, as in this case, a BFA or MFA thesis exhibition, which has artwork, which has nudes, or it has Confederate symbols, and somebody along the chain of command, like the provost or external relations or alumni relations, says, you need to take this down. This is really damaging. When it goes up to legal will look up the cases that I just shared with you, and they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, if it's a public institution, like you have to leave it up. And so that's kind of, and in this case, you cannot throw her out, right? So the case law really does support the students and curators on campus. Of course, that is a public institution, and it's of course very, academic art museums and galleries are as diverse as the kinds of higher ed institutions that we have in the United States. They vary enormously in size, staffing, location, audience, funding sources, and range of exhibitions. Some campus galleries are just like a gallery for the art department that's like in the art building. And some are internationally known, like University of Minnesota has a huge campus that's really kind of, again, facing nationally and internationally. And so we have to remember that we're talking about really, apples and oranges and kumquats and grapes and figs and all that kind of thing. Lots and lots of different kinds of institutions. One thing they really shared when I did the survey was that 78% of curators and directors surveyed said that freedom of artistic expression is essential, and 22% said very important, and 51% felt that they have more freedom of artistic expression than other kinds of museums. And one curator wrote, how can I break these rules as quickly as possible? That's what happens. Then those are the artists that we are supposed to be showing in an academic gallery, because academic galleries are the places to push the boundaries, to have those discussions, to utilize those spaces for educating ourselves on those topics, as opposed to just shutting them down and saying they don't exist. And I think you can hear in this language where we are about to be on a collision course with these divisive concept bills and laws, because the kinds of things young artists often want to talk about are grappling with the hypocrisies of the world, or imagining some more kind of inclusive or progressive or just a different kind of society than the one that they're living in. And this is also this kind of language, right? You could apply to the conversations we can have in the classroom, right? And the worries about academic freedom. So these things go hand in hand. We're worried about threats to academic freedom. We should be just as worried about threats to artistic freedom of expression in exactly the same ways. I asked, what types of constraints have you placed on art exhibitions in the past, and for what types of content / viewpoint? So I'm putting together here two different survey questions. So the most common answer was that people had not, 39 out of 71 curators and directors said they had not placed constraints on the exhibition of art in the past, but that we dropped off. As far as the future, fewer people answered that question, and there were definitely fewer people who predicted that there would be no constraints placed on art in their, campus gallery in the future. Racial stereotypes came up very high. Pro-Confederate symbols, that's really interesting. In the past, just 2, but expecting, this is interesting, 16 people saying they expect there to be constraints. So does that mean they're expecting more people to assert their right to display art with Confederate symbols? Graphic sexuality also went up from 10 to 16, images of racial violence. And of course, these are the issues that really have been of the last, 5 years, especially since the murder of George Floyd. Images of racial violence, obviously being deemed to be very traumatic. This one I thought was interesting. Artists' known views, statements, and or actions are problematic, even if not reflected in the proposed art. So here we're talking about those artists who are sort of in the kind of hashtag Me Too category. Colonization, the American flag, actually, only 2 people said that they had constrained art on the basis of, having an American flag transformed or damaged in a negative manner. This is definitely kind of like a no-no. There's a lot, there is jurisprudence that supports the desecration of the American flag as a form of artistic expression. And then at the bottom, we see nudity holding pretty steady at 9 and 9. Okay. So people expect much more censorship and the kinds of things, actually, I didn't use the word censorship. I used another C word, constraints, right? Because censorship it's its own kind of like trigger. People don't want to see themselves as censors. But the 2 most frequent strategies employed by decision makers exhibiting potentially controversial art are less visible placement and content warnings. Now, that less visible placement, this is really typical. If you have a 2-story gallery and you have school groups that come, the exhibitions with the nudes will go on the 2nd floor and the shows for the kids will go on the 1st floor. And that really kind of makes a lot of sense. And courts have upheld that as a very reasonable kind of time, place, and manner restriction. Content warnings are more, let's say, controversial because they're really easy to do. You put a sign like around the corner, you might see something that upsets you. You put a sign at the front of the museum. But some artists and museum professionals feel that they prejudice and limit the viewer's interpretation and appreciation of the work displayed. People feel sometimes like they're being othered, like if it's an LGBTQ point of view, they feel like they're being like marginalized before people even see their artwork. And some artists refuse to have their work displayed in that way. Most common justification for placing constraints is avoiding emotional and psychological harm. And people talk about a lot of things, not just to visitors, but also to the gallery security staff in some cases. Okay, so there are important differences between freely curating, self-censorship, and censorship. And I always like to remind everyone that curators make choices, right? That's what they get paid to do. I'm showing this and I'm not showing that. So that's curating, right? And that's where the decision is being made by the trained professional who has the job of deciding what's going to be on exhibition. That is their mission and role on campus. That's curating. Self-censorship frequently results from answers to those questions that I started us with, right? I'm afraid of losing my job. I'm afraid that the state legislature is going to take funding away from my museum on a public campus or threaten funding for the university as a whole, as has happened on many occasions. I am afraid that that there are bomb threats to my campus art museum, or social media threats, or more immediate threats that people like curators and directors might receive, or artists, and that people might actually damage the art on display, right? And curators are supposed to care for art, right? So they don't want to display art in a way that subjects it to being damaged by vandals or domestic terrorists or whatever. So that's sort of self-censorship. And then when we get to flat out censorship, Svetlana Mincheva, who's at the actually recently retired from the National Coalition Against Censorship. She writes, while there may be many reasons to include or exclude a specific work or a particular artist in the programming of an institution, self-censorship can be defined as the decision to cancel a show or exclude a work or an artist solely because of potential external pressure and the fear of controversy or repercussions. So I'm sorry, she's saying that that's self-censorship. And what I'm saying is that when a curator decides they want to show something, but that decision, that fear is actually realized, that the exhibition decision made by the museum professional is overridden by an administrator, donor, or state legislature, then it's definitely censorship, right? And that's where we potentially get into violations of, what First Amendment rights, are held by people studying on and employed by public university campuses. And that's being debated right now, actually, in Florida in the litigation surrounding the Woke Act. Okay, just some survey questions that I found sort of interesting and pertinent. When we get to that thing of like, everyone wants to talk about this, but nobody's talking about this. Do you ever discuss federal, state, or local laws or regulations when making decisions about what art you will exhibit on the basis of its content or viewpoints? 59% said never, only 4% said often, 28% said rarely. Are you aware of any local, state, or federal laws or regulations that govern the exhibition of art on your campus on the basis of its content and our viewpoints? 38 people said First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but most of those people actually worked on private college and university campuses. So the First Amendment actually didn't apply to them. Designation as a public forum, those 6 people clearly had a little bit more kind of education in law surrounding this, because again, we saw that, turn up in the, Oregon case regarding, public forum and the requirements for showing work if it's been accepted, even if it creates controversy. Now, here's where I think there's opportunity, not for me because I'm not a lawyer, but for places like Center for Art Law to consider creating professional development. Does your institution have a plan for dealing with public controversy should it arise? No, and we probably should do that. Yes, although more could be done at 32%, people should know what the law is surrounding what they, can and can't do, and be able to articulate for people who may be complaining what the courts have held to be artists' rights and that need to be upheld on our public college and university campuses. Do you think it would be helpful to have more dialogue about the concept of freedom of artistic expression in your institution? 56% yes, 37% maybe. Have you received any professional development training regarding legal, social, sorry, I can't see that on my screen, the dimensions of freedom of artistic expression, and no. And when I looked at professional organizations like the Association of Academic Museums and Galleries, and even the Alliance of American Museums, there was no workshop. There was no sign up for this to talk to, an art lawyer about freedom of expression. And 78% of people who said that they hadn't had that opportunity wanted that opportunity. So I definitely think that there is not just an opportunity here to meet that demand, but a necessity to meet that demand, because freedom of expression, academic freedom, these are core requisites for upholding democratic norms of pluralism and a kind of a vibrant community conversation through which different members of our community have the opportunity to share their point of view, their expertise, their skills and knowledge. And artists are so often play a role in envisioning a future that we can then hold on to and through visualization find a kind of a sense of hope and maybe even like a trajectory. So I think when people say there are a lot of conversations that can happen in an academic museum and gallery looking at a work of art that can be debated, that we can see in different ways, that can help us see in different ways, that creativity needs to be supported. And if it isn't, it will atrophy. We only have as much freedom of expression as we insist on having. So the fact that this isn't being discussed, I find, quite worrisome. So with that, I've left about 20 minutes for conversation. I'm interested in, I talked about a lot of different things that really kind of the trajectory of my work over the last 20 years. And I'm wondering if you find anything kind of relevant to your interests. Maybe I'm overreacting.
We'd love to hear from the audience. So if you guys have any questions, you can either raise your hand, put it in the chat, or you can just speak now as well. We have a good amount of time for conversation to discuss this. But in the meantime, Amy, what are a couple of the things that artists have done in case their work has been taken down, or if they have been censored? What do they usually do? What's the recourse that's available to them?
Well, I think it really varies because, at the end of the day, artists need to pay the rent like everybody else. Mm-hmm. So I think, some artists really use the publicity. Some artists really try to become like bad, women, men, non-binary people, you know what I mean? They try to get known for being edgy because that has a market value. But you have to hit that line just right, because if you just become known as kind of a troll or a bore, that's not going to help your career. But I certainly think somebody like Mikhail Hebron and some of these artists who are creating websites, they are hoping to attract patrons and dealers who are interested in showing edgier work. So I think that's one response. But then I think probably many more artists just turn to something that maybe they think is more saleable, more easy to exhibit, especially if you think about most people don't live in New York City, right? That desire to kind of you don't like this, here, take 10 more of them. That's much easier to do in a kind of cosmopolitan urban area where the standards are really low, right? We're in New York and standards for what's obscene here are basically non-existent. So it depends on what community you're in, and we don't know what people don't make, or we don't know what people stop making, or don't exhibit and keep at home.
Yeah,
all those things, and I think that's where it's always sort of like a balance. And we started out talking about different countries, right? It depends on what country you're in. If you're afraid of being murdered or thrown in jail, that's really different than if what you're mostly afraid of is getting, trolled on social media. I see a hand up.
Joseph.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for speaking with us. My name is Joseph. I'm co-president of the Artist Representation Society at Fordham. So we have a good group of us here today. Excited to hear the talk. I just had a question about what's the percentage between public and private institutions of the schools that you surveyed, and also of what parts of the country they were from, and if you saw certain trends of different parts of the country.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I would say, I want to say it's maybe roughly 50-50 public and private, but I had religious institutions. I had some Catholic campuses, some Baptist campuses. As I mentioned, I had a tribal college curator that I spoke with. I think I was actually expecting that, the whole South was going to be really conservative, and actually it played out. Each campus had its own very particular microclimate. And some of it, some people who were in very conservative states who told me, well, people are very conservative here, but we fly beneath the radar. That was something I heard a lot. Like that the community wasn't interested in going to the campus art museum. So the students were able to basically exhibit whatever they wanted. And sometimes they were exhibiting, not lots of, but nudity is pretty common for, if you can imagine students, college age students often exploring issues of sexuality, like trying to kind of, grow into adulthood in that phase of their lives. And but I spoke with several curators in really conservative places who just said, look, even if we put it out there, people just won't come, and they'll wait for an exhibition that they want to see. And I thought that was actually pretty heartening, that the reality was the stories where you get politicians, the Ted Cruz's sort of trying to like advertise, oh, look at this horrible art being displayed on campus, is kind of relatively few and far between as compared with the places where people are willing, well, just let the kids be the kids, and we'll come back when you do that impressionist landscape exhibition we like. Hope that answers your question. I definitely think that the diversity of our higher education institutions is a huge advantage, because like in China, the Chinese, all of higher education is under the Ministry of Education for the Chinese Communist Party. So everything is centralized, like the curriculum that gets sent out, to all the campuses. And there are a few exceptions to that, but we don't have any kind of centralization for our kind of higher ed as a whole. It's incredibly diverse, and the experiences of curators and directors were really, really different.
I just had a follow-up question with that, if that's okay.
Sure.
So yeah, you mentioned China. I had studied abroad in Shanghai in art history years ago, and I mean, I remember the Shanghai Biennial being heavily curated, and that just, heavily censored, and that
Yes.
just, just the norm of it. But then I'm just thinking back to like, I guess the not centralized of academics, but like the National Endowment for the Arts, the federal program, and then thinking about like that history of their culture wars of the 1980s, and that they really stopped funding controversial things. Has that changed at all? I mean, does the NEA just sort of steer clear of anything?
Yeah, they just steer clear. I mean, they wouldn't fund my work. And actually, people who I've spoken with, academics who do, for example, research on sexuality, who cannot get any funding from state or federal governments. And we're talking about sexuality being like the way we create new human beings. You know what I mean? This isn't like some marginal facet of human existence. But funding agencies don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. So, maybe you can get private funding. But I would say that we've had a kind of a very quiet slide into a situation where the kinds of things that were funded before the 1980s culture wars never really came back to being funded in the same way, even after the culture wars maybe left the front pages of newspapers for a while. But now, of course, they're really back. And that's why I think you're going to see a lot more litigation as there's more friction between politicians who are, kind of scoring points through these culture war controversies. Look what they did to the American flag. This is, and the attack on higher ed, right? This is a perfect way to kind of dig in deeper, the attack on higher ed and, liberal faculty and all that. It's just, I do think that art museums and galleries have flown a little bit under the radar. And I mean, I kind of feel like a lot of people were satisfied, like, as long as we don't advertise our shows. And I sort of thought, is that really the solution here? Like, we'll be able to show the controversial work, but then only like a very tiny number of people will see it. It's a little bit like shadow banning on social media. Like if people post things and maybe it's not exactly taken down, but the algorithms will really kind of suppress it being shared. So that is also another kind of, I like to look at these sort of conceptual frameworks for what happens to speech when it is suppressed, and the mechanisms of suppression, which really cross over from real life to online platforms. I'm just looking at some of the questions going back here. Correct to say people who are organizing forums, private org, are more towards on the trend to be constrained. Well, I think with private, that's the thing, like if you look at those social media, those artists getting censored on Instagram who are going over to Pornhub or OnlyFans or creating their own sites for, having, sexually explicit work that's on the web. I think it just really varies, because I think it also produces a kind of a polarization. So the Instagram might be very, kind of heavily censored, I would say whitewashed or sex washed but then you're going to have these other platforms where the work gets really edgy, right? Because there's no constraint whatsoever, and people are migrating there. That same phenomenon happens, it's been discussed a lot when certain kinds of political speech gets thrown off of social media, and people kind of hook up, like the people who are Confederate rebels hook up with the QAnon people on sites and start to kind of morph together, which is definitely a little scary. All right. How do we think we should apply community standards concept in electronic media? That is something that is being debated. I really like to watch the webinars on Stanford cybersecurity policy. They have some really smart people talking about the legislation that's really global, right? I mean, the UK has its own white paper, the EU has its own standards, and now Amy Klobuchar has been sort of very visible in this goal of regulating big tech. Maybe, again, like modifying Section 230, which basically says that social media platforms are not publishers and they have no liability for the content on their sites. But yeah, because the information is global, that it involves so much technology as well as law to think about how speech is censored in which communities. I mean, there's definitely not one global community, that's for sure. So I would say that is a question that I struggle to understand because of the technology and because of the complexity of it, but they're very smart people kind of working on it. I've just been like watching for the art censorship ramifications and seeing what is happening with art and what artists do. Okay, I wonder if the diversity in approaches and lack of clarity about the status of the laws works to limit self-censorship and censorship. I think that actually that's a pretty good point, because I think people assume, sometimes people assume I'm an American, right? I have First Amendment rights, like all those people working on private college campuses who don't know that actually their private employer could basically say, this is disruptive, this is hostile workplace environment. And because they're not under the umbrella of the First Amendment in their job, they don't have any kind of legal protection in the courts. So I definitely think that that is something to think about. And that's where I like to say we need to educate people about the importance of freedom of expression, not just the law regarding freedom of expression, but what do we lose? Let's look back historically at all the incredible art. I mean, the Agnew Clinic is such an amazing painting, and imagining what would have been lost if that had been, not been taken in by the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, which of course doctors not so squeamish about nudity. So that's where I like to think that talking about the history is really important. Curly, hi Curly. Curly's my student at FIT and applying to law school. So keep an eye out for Curly because she's going to be coming into your domain. Okay, hi, I was hoping you could expand on the criteria for obscenity in relationship to art. I believe you mentioned that among many things, educational value is required to protect speech or art from being considered obscene. When considering if a controversial work is obscene, is it possible for artworks that don't deal with historical matter to argue for their educational value? It's actually not educational value. It's like literary, artistic, political, scientific. So something could be like something you would never want your kids to see because you would never want to try to have to explain that, but it could still have literary merit within a broader, that contemporary community standard. And again, these are all, whenever you have these vague terms, what is a community? What is a reasonable person, right? That's where culture comes in, because the law has created a certain room for change in culture. So that definition of what is obscene, what is considered to be only that it should only be seen off stage, obscene, out of the public eye, right? That changes in every kind of micro community, right? Like even within your own family. My parents, right? They think a lot of stuff is obscene that I don't think is obscene. We've had an argument about that. But so you think about how kind of micro these things are, that's where again, I think sometimes the law is, people think it's enough to read the decision, but then when you see the way judges and juries and district attorneys, prosecutors behave, you see where culture comes into what people are thinking they can actually get a conviction on. Okay. Joseph, do you want to follow up? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question with that. I mean, in general, is like who decides what is that answer in a court? Would it be a judge or a jury?
Well, if you are, convicted of circulating obscenity, people used to go to jail for this, like on a pretty regular basis. The last mainstream publisher who did that was in 1972, I believe, Ralph Ginsburg. And this is where, this is where my legal historian, my not being a lawyer and thing kind of breaks down. I definitely think you would need to go back, because there aren't that many of these right now, as far as the balance between criminal and civil penalties. But, obscenity, just like hate speech is, or not hate speech, but incitement to violence is a crime. So I think it gets prosecuted in criminal court. I hope that answers your question. But my big answer to you is that I would definitely say all you law students look up the case law and don't rely on your history of art professor to give you the best guidance there. Josephine asks, this is more of a broad question, but I sometimes find myself struggling between two poles when it comes to censorship. I believe censorship of expression should not be condoned, but I think censorship can seemingly serve a public benefit, like the removal of Confederate monuments from public spaces and the removal of names from buildings. Is your opinion, could there ever be such a thing as good censorship? That's such a great question. It's such a great question to end on. What I want to say about that is, for me, I'm looking for the conversation, because in the conversation about Confederate monuments, the way democracy should work is, and I'm a former school board member. I loved being on the school board because people would come and they would debate different points of view, and we would listen to each other and learn from each other. And then at the end of the day, us elected school board members would vote on the basis of the community in front of us. And I think that the best thing that's happening with the Confederate monuments is where there's a whole, community conversation about the history that has been erased, that has been whitewashed. These Confederate monuments are a form of propaganda. Some people don't see them that way, but have the conversation and then take the vote and then abide by the vote. That's the rule of law. And I think, the Confederate monument thing, as lawyers, you should know, they vary a lot in terms of who owns them, who owns the land they're on. So the cases are really fascinating and very individual. But when they do belong to a municipality, or the municipality has the charge for conserving the monument, which was a very typical kind of contract with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which erected many of them, then it is a question for, should taxpayer dollars keep being put towards maintaining this monument, or it should be a community decision about naming things. So I do think that having a process that strengthens democracy is really important, and views on these things are always going to change, and we're not necessarily going to win our side of things 100% of the time. But I think that's what Athreya started out talking about, that if you basically say, well, I'm just going to censor any speech I don't like, then you without regard to process or law or any regard for freedom of expression, then you will suffer. And we are suffering that right now with this rise of CRT bills, the idea of censoring things that make people uncomfortable from the right perspective. This has been an argument made on the left. It's valid. They're all valid arguments, but it is a system and a process of how we evaluate speech. So I'm just looking at the very last question. Concerned that the application of current community standards in terms of obscenity, violence, or other cultural taboos has potential to cause us to eliminate history. Yes, absolutely. And that's where, museums have such an important job to preserve, and curators take very seriously their job to conserve art. And a lot of these monuments, they're not being destroyed. Some are, but many of them are being moved to places where they are being kind of, the record of their existence is very important, so that we can kind of remember our history. And with that, it is 1 o'clock. What a great conversation. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amy, for taking the time out and being with us today, for all of the information and the fantastic presentation. We so appreciate you sharing your research, your experience. And I know I had a ton to learn and take away from the session, as I'm sure the audience did as well. The societal implications, artistic standards, legal perspectives. So thank you so much. And to the audience, thank you for joining us and contributing to the discussion, and all of your questions were so helpful to understand the topic better. So thank you, Amy.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye.